refreshed and ready for a second day of deciphering non-human communication. We'll start out today with Roberto. Take it away.
Can you hear me? Thanks a lot for being here today, and thanks for the organizer, for putting up such a nice event. I'm Roberto Dessi, and I'm a last year PhD student at UPF as part of an industrial PhD with Meta AI in Paris. And today I'll be talking about deep emergent communication, a bit about the field, how it started, the basic research question behind it, how things are going now, and possibly how they look ahead in the future. And I want to acknowledge that I benefited from interacting with Emmanuel Chemla in Paris while preparing this presentation, and also that the material that I'm showing is partially adapted from a tutorial that me and Marco Baroni, my supervisor, and Angeliki Lazaridou gave at EMNLP at the end of 2022. So I'll talk a bit about what we mean with deep emergent communication, hopefully clarifying what does deep emergent communication means, talking a bit about the standard setup, which is used in the experimental setup use, which is the communication game, surveying some relevant results and some work that we did in the area. And then in the second part, talking a bit about what it means to do deep emergent communication when big, powerful models like large language models are available, an experiment on using off-the-shelf communication in multimodal language models, and then a bit of speculation on where the field might go ahead, and some connection with the non-human communication, or specifically ethno communication. So if I were to hope to give you one take-home message from this presentation, is that you wouldn't be asking this question at the end of the talk, or if you would, or at least heard somebody asking, you wouldn't say something like answering to, can someone explain to me what is emergent communication? You wouldn't say, I don't understand why people care about the problem. What's the application? It seems like an irrelevant research area to me. And this is from a Reddit thread that I found. Or maybe even worse, you wouldn't say, do you mean the satellite telephone or message which is used to connect someone in emergency situations? Yes, that was my reaction before like crying. But so actually, this is not emergent communication, what we mean, or why we say emergent communication, but instead, what emergent communication tries to do is motivated by the observation that human intelligence relies on the ability to communicate and use language to interact and engage in complex social behaviors. And I think David put it nicely yesterday during the introduction, that like we got here yesterday and today to collaborate in order to achieve much more together than we can achieve alone. And I think the very powerful medium that we use to achieve this collaboration is language, that allows us to coordinate and engage and interact in very dynamic and complex situations. So this is with humans. How's the trend in deep neural network instead, deep neural agents? So in the recent years, many new powerful architectures have been introduced. Transformer have been around. I think we heard naming them all over the place yesterday, and some other architecture like Inception, BERT. Their performance have improved, and they started powering interesting applications or being applied for interesting use cases, from protein folding to beating humans at very complex games, or powering search engines. And they're very good at doing these single applications. And for this reason, a question arises on whether they could also learn to coordinate and, like humans do, cooperate and use language to unlock new, more complex abilities. For this reason, if I were to give a definition of what deep emergent communication is the field of research where the agents with no pre-existing communication protocol engage in interaction. And in this interaction, their goal is to bootstrap, to cooperate while bootstrapping a communication protocol which acts as a sort of shared language. And this shared language that gets created as an effect of the interaction has some nice properties that we are interested in studying and trying to understand from a more like experimental point of view. It's not a, it is a very multidisciplinary field, encompassing very different disciplines from linguistics to computer science, AI, and it can be used to investigate different questions. So for instance, it can be used as an experimental framework for language emergence and evolution. This is due to the fact that we are sort of letting the agents evolve their own language. And it can be used to study linguistic hypotheses connected to how language can be acquired, how language can get created through social interaction, or how it can evolve through generation as an effect of things like social learning. Another interesting aspect that can be studied is the fact that this is an alternative paradigm compared to how neural networks are learning language nowadays. So in large language models, I think there was somebody explaining it yesterday as well, these models are learning language by being exposed passively to loads amount of written text, to trillion of tokens, and simply by learning to predict the next token, they bootstrap their own linguistic skills. Whereas here, in this alternative view, the language learning inspired by how humans interact is learned through cooperation and continuous interaction. And finally, if we are able to let this model interact and communicate, we might able to give them a possibility to unlock new capabilities and coordinate among themselves to achieve things like having a division of labor, a specialization of labors, and unlock new interesting capabilities. So if I think you are more interested in the scientific aspect of the question, then I think the first sub area is what's more relevant for people, which is related to more like scientific endeavors, sort of incrementally going towards more like engineering and applied questions of how we can actually create some working application that uses agents to coordinate. And all these aspects are not standalone blocks, but they interact, and ideas sort of like flow between each subfield. Doing research in emergent communication really means sort of like moving towards these circles, and oftentimes being in the middle of, at the intersection of two of these. So hopefully after this brief introduction, you got an idea of what is deep emergent communication. And now I'm going to be covering the standard setup, the communication game, which is not the only one. There are other setups being used, but this is very likely the most used, given its simplicity and how it can let us investigate specific questions in a controlled setup. Communication game is depicted as follows. So we have an agent. You can see there as like your favorite general purpose neural network that gets an input. It can be, for instance, an image, this orange chair, and it needs to come up with a description, which is a message of this image, which is possibly a sequence of discrete tokens that can have a variable length. And this message gets generated by the sender agent. It gets passed through the receiver, which gets as input a list of candidates, including the target input, which again is the image of the orange chair, and needs to come up with a decision on where it thinks the object related to the message is placed in the list. After this continuous interaction, the way we, during this continuous interaction, the way we teach this model how to do the task is to give them feedback, which is a shared reward. That's why it's a cooperative task. And the goal is whether the receiver agent was able to correctly guess the position. And this is the only reward that we provide to the agent while they're training. And what we call language is actually this mapping from meanings, so on the input side, to messages that starts as random, given that the agent.
Do the sender and receiver always have the same architecture?
Not necessarily, but and they also don't need to have fixed roles. In practice, that's often what is done. just for simplicity, but there are some work where you can have like, both turns happening. But no, I mean, also because the task is sort of like symmetric. This agent is going from images to text. The other is going from text to images. So they share some building blocks. Transformer is used, for instance, but they don't necessarily need to share the same. So yeah, what I was saying is we call language this mapping between meanings, which here are images, and messages that starts as random, given that the agents don't have any pre-encoded linguistic knowledge, and sorts of evolves, gets bootstrapped, and gets somehow structured and become random throughout the game playing. Some interesting things is, again, these agents, you have to see them as like tabula rasa. They learn how to do the task, and as a side effect, as a byproduct of this learning how to referring to things, they do develop their own, for them meaningful language. There is no direct supervision on this communication channel. Again, the only supervision is feedback, and this channel is called often cheap talk from the literature, which is a costless channel, meaning that the agents do not have to pay any type of cost or penalty when they generate a message. So they don't have any penalty to pay if they emit an additional token or something like that. Everything is completely free. And messages are discrete rather than continuous. There is some research investigating continuous communication in this setup, but the reason why I mostly cover what I studied, what I think it's relevant for us is discrete messages, is because if we're interested in things like language evolution, questions related to language evolution, then it makes sense to have a discrete bottleneck there, being that we want to have a language which is discrete and similar to human language. And also because if we want to have a more applied spin, if we put humans in this setup, then there must be some sort of discrete language-like interface for human to understand, to interpret what they're saying and interact. And some might argue that this stack is pretty simple, but I think the important bit is that discrimination is a very important task to do, and is the sort of building block of more complex tasks. If we are to interact with an environment, manipulating objects, or do things in the wild, we always rely to the fact that we can refer and recognize and discriminate objects as the first step towards more complex abilities. So I'm now going to review a bit of the relevant results that have been found in the literature, and also some of our contribution exploiting this setup. This is a paper by Lazaridou and colleagues from 2017, which is the first paper that used natural images, realistic images, as you can find them in computer vision data sets in this communication game, in the referential game. So the agent would see 2 images, and it was informed that the target would be a pizza here. It needs to come up with a description, and then again the receiver needs to point to the pizza. And the agents were trained, as I said, with this reward. And at the end of their training phase, at test time, they would be presented with new unseen images of the same categories. And without any type of training or adaptation, they would need to use the language that they evolved to still refer to these unseen objects. And it turned out that they can successfully, with very high accuracy, almost perfect accuracy, learn how to do this task with unseen images. And accuracy is computed just by how many times the receiver can pinpoint the right object, sort of like hinting that the agents learn a meaningful protocol that allow them to correctly solve the task, and that this message is sort of describing in the best way possible the content of the images.
So just a quick question regarding terminology. So basically what you call language is essentially a vocabulary, right? It's just a lookup table that associates images, right, or inputs of other type with words. A language has much more structure, it has grammar. Is it, what exactly do you call language?
So I call language is non-random mapping. And it has been found that there is some sort of structure that is similar to natural language. I mean, the natural language is much more complex, but some properties of natural language, as you see later, if you tweak the game a little bit, do tend to emerge in this vocabulary learning that the agents are doing. So they're not, given how sort of like simplified the setup is, they're not really engaging in more complex tasks that require more complex languages. But potentially this can be as like a first step towards more interactive things. Like if they develop their own vocabulary, then they might, you know, combine the more complex setups to like give goals, give direction to another agent, and then still like use this bootstrap.
If you don't put any constraint on the message, how do you prevent the agents from just kind of repeating the input, which is kind of discrete? So the message could be just, you know, the image again, right?
I mean, here we are imposing a discrete bottleneck. So it would be something like forcing this agent to sample from a fixed size vocabulary and selecting like a fixed sequence of 10 tokens, which is like sort of a way of compressing. So we impose some sort of compression of the input image. So the agent cannot really regenerate the image, the sender.
Okay.
I guess this.
There is no constraint on length, but there is a constraint on you know, how many characters you have your display.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Something I forgot to say is that this this message generation is often done through providing the agents with a fixed size vocabulary, which again is much smaller than the input size. And the agents can select a variable number of tokens from this fixed size vocabulary. And I think you can see language as a sort of like compression, discrete representation of the real world that we use.
Well, maybe I'm anticipating, but do you see compositionality? So let's say I have input that includes both the cat and the pizza. Wouldn't be a combination of tokens that corresponds to each individual input?
So I'm not presenting result about compositionality, but there have been many work trying to find it. So I think the take-home and bottom line message is compositionality might emerge, but it's not necessary to solve the task. So it's sort of like happening as a lucky, you know, convergence point that the agents found, but it's not something that is really needed for the agent to solve the task. And also like quantifying and finding compositionality, I think it's a whole like subfield in itself. So it's not like a suite of problems, you can just like, you know, define the question properly.
Just on this, so in my mind, I was like, compositionality emerges when it's necessary to solve this task, obviously, but you're saying it might also just happen to emerge even when it's not necessary to solve, even when the environment wasn't designed with compositionality in mind.
Yes, I mean, there is no correlation between accuracy and compositionality. Yes.
It depends on the, yeah. Some in, okay.
Can, for example, use something embedding the transformer or the transformer to generate these messages, or do we need some other guarantees for such messages? Like, you show an image of pizza, the embedding of the transformer can be presented in somehow. Do we need some other guarantees for such messages?
I'm not sure I understood the question, but you have to remember that these transformer-based agents do not have any type of knowledge of what a pizza is. They are untrained, so they start from scratch. So they wouldn't have any, you know, embedding representation of what a pizza is. They sort of just like learn how to use a representation while also developing the representation. Okay, so this sort of like show that these agents can learn how to name objects, which, yeah, maybe it's a more precise example of like using the vocabulary of, you know, what I was calling language. The follow-up work by Bouchaccourt and colleagues, they replicated the same setup, let the agents play this naming game, this referential game, and then they again tested this agent on unseen objects, and they successfully showed the same performance that was reported in the previous paper. But interestingly, when at test time, instead of input coming from natural images, they provided the agents with blobs of random Gaussian noise, which was completely undistinguishable at the naked human eye. Surprisingly, these agents were still able to coordinate and recognize which one was the target image among the two, with the same very, very high accuracy that was shown in the other test setup with real images or at training time.
What was the difference between random noise? Was it
Two different sampling of random Gaussian noise.
same distribution? How can you distinguish two different samples?
No, but it's copied to the output.
I mean, between these two, they're the same, but they're the same for the sender and the receiver. And even, I mean, as you see here, like it's the same pizza, just like the same noise.
If you swap the in the previous slide, if you swap it with different images from the same class, like different image of a, does it get off the ground? Like, does it work?
This is what they did here, right? So the
But it's the same image of a pizza.
yeah. Oh, you mean like if you have different?
Yeah, like speaker sees some image of a pizza with mushrooms, and then the listener has different images, and the pizza now has olives.
I'm showing this in a bit, and it has some nice results.
Yeah, you might also get into this, but I'm curious about like what happens if you don't give the receiver sort of a multiple choice to choose from and say, you know, okay, what do you think this piece of language that you got is referring to a picture of, like generated picture.
Also, like a reconstruction game.
Yeah.
I think that'd be interesting. Back then, I think people weren't really trying this reconstruction game with real images. They were doing it with more like disentangled representation of symbolic input, and have some results on a setup like that later. I think mostly because it was really hard to generate images. There was like, discrete representation learning happening around the time, but I guess the some fields weren't really talking to each other. So I'm not aware of any work that tries to do it, but
I'm also curious about what the language looked like. Like, was it sequences of letters? Like, what were the sequences?
like in this setup.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean here, like I should have done better was they actually had to come up with a single symbol, so like really like picking a word. So in this case, it wasn't variable or like length longer than one, but in other setup, yes, you would see some sort of like random sequence of words happening, which might not seem meaningful for us, but they were meaningful for them. So this experiment sort of showed that the emergent language is a degenerate language, so it's not really looking like human language, and the communication is happening through relying on low-level perceptual features of the input, something like, hey, the target is the one that has the top left pixel being larger than the top right one. Which is not what we human do when we say like when we convey the meaning as a high-level semantic information, like categories like dog and cat. I mean, from their point of view, it sort of makes sense. Like if you as a human were always throughout your life just asked to do this simple discrimination game, you wouldn't need to use any type of more complex clustering or representation of your input, and you might be as well getting away with simple communication strategies like these low-level perceptual features communication. And this sort of like tells us that we might need to adapt a bit our setup and our experimental configuration if we want some more interesting properties to emerge. This is some work that we did 2 years ago, where we have like a similar setup to the one shown earlier. Then the sender would see an input images like a bike, for instance. The receiver would see again the usual image plus what we call distractors. But then this time, so similar to what you were saying, we would be applying data augmentation. So data augmentation is this process that sort of randomly perturbs the images, modifying things like randomly perturbing colors, doing things like random cropping, flipping of the images while preserving the semantic content. So if this is a lion here, if you do a random data augmentation, you would end up with some rotation or something like this flipped one. This means that the agent wouldn't see exactly the same image. They would still see this bike, but it would be randomly slightly different for them while keeping some invariances. And I think this is interesting because it's very similar to how we humans perceive the world. So I can like talk with any of you and describe and coordinate by saying things like, hey, can you fetch my laptop? And we wouldn't be seeing the laptop from the same point of view or under the same lighting condition, yet we are able to achieve perfect coordination and referring to the object. After training the agents with this slight tweak to the game, they're able to coordinate on unseen images, like shown before. But what they did here instead is failing at this test, which is something we want them to do. This means that when the input was a blobs of random Gaussian noise, the receiver would be performing at random chance. It wouldn't be able to recognize which one was the correct target random Gaussian noise. Sort of telling us that at least their communication strategies is not relying on low-level perceptual features, and we hope it was relying on something that is closer to what human language does. And what we found is it's shown here. So basically, here I'm just like showing some symbol that they came up with. You can see them as labels or words, and I'm grouping the images, a random subset of the images that were described by that given symbol. And I guess we can all agree that this categorization is similar to some semantic categorization of what humans use, even though it's not exactly the same category that the annotators did in the dataset, because they would be saying like the type of bird, specific bird that this one is. But at least we sort of understand that their categorization is saying something like, a symbol 1 means to a bird on a branch of a tree, or symbol 4 doesn't say bear or dog, but it says something like four-legged animal walking in the grass.
What's symbol 2?
So we thought it was more like very dark, but like object. Like here is, for instance, like geometric shape on a flat surface. You can come up with all sorts of funny description of categorization, but at least I think it's evident that there is some coherence in this. Okay, then this is instead an interesting study from Ciabuni and colleagues and Mattia and colleagues, where they have now the reconstruction game, with the input being disentangled representation of vectors. So you can see this as indexes of perceptual features like color, shape, with numbers being specific values within this perceptual axis. And the sender would get this as input, and the receiver would need to reconstruct and regenerate it. And this is like a power law distribution. I think Isabel showed yesterday, and this is a property that is found in human languages. And what they did is basically they sampled input objects based on this power law distribution. So they weren't uniformly sampled when given as input to the agent. And this is an interesting distribution because it's something that's been found in human language with a frequency and length of the words of the messages being inversely correlated. The results is here. So you can see the red on the y-axis the message length, on the x-axis the frequency of the messages. The red line is for emergent languages, so protocols that are evolved by the agents. And at the bottom you can see the green one as being some sort of optimal coding for the input data. And these other colored line are instead human languages like Spanish, English, Russian, or Arabic. I think it's clear that emergent languages are not really showing the same relation that natural languages have. They actually have the opposite one. So they have, they show the fact that more frequent inputs being here actually have the greater length. with as soon as we go towards the tail of the distribution, length decreasing, which is the opposite that happens instead on human language.
So is this always in the same situation where there is no cost on the message?
Yes.
Exactly the same question.
This is where we add some constraints. So and they, Rita and colleagues, they instead add some constraints on the sender agent. So the agent would pay a penalty for generating an extra symbol, and the receiver would be instead forced, made more eager to guess and solve the task and being rewarded if it correctly did after each symbol being generated. So being impatient in a sort of way. So top line is some of their implementation of these unconstrained agents, and the bottom line we see the red one being the mean in natural languages, and the blue one now being these constrained agents. So I think here it's interesting that not only now there is some sort of zip flow distribution like arising, but the property of these emergent languages seem very, very much similar to the one of natural languages.
Is there any relation to the complexity of the alphabet you're using? So I think in human languages, and sorry if I'm not using the right terminology, so there is this relation somehow between the complexity of the communication system, let's say number of different distinct phonemes that there are and the length of the word. So overall, the product is more or less constant. Do you observe something similar here?
It's really hard to talk about like different levels of units in these emergent languages. There's been like some work that I'm just referring but not showing, where there is some sort of more like phoneme detection being applied to these emergent languages. But I think it's not really easy how to disentangle these two representations that instead are present in human languages, but don't have a clear mapping with this. And it's also like, yeah, it's also not super easy to like quantify complexity here. It would be like the number of unique messages in the vocabulary that they develop, but it might be like a bit of a super useful metric. But it's an important question. I think it's sort of like hard to like define it properly.
Just on this, there was this work that studied the complexity of the emergent language as a function of like two parameters. One is the number of distractors. For example, it was something like that, or the ratio of the input to the number of distractors. And the other one was the class of images, like the complexity of the class of images that you will have to distinguish from. So that was a couple, and it behaves like how you expect it, but it's cool that they did that nonetheless. But it's not really like alphabet to, yeah. It was in iClear last year. I can't remember. Sorry, but I'll try to find it. The second thing is on this. So if you go to the previous, before you add the constraints, and you have this very strange behavior. Yeah, exactly. So I think the explanation there was like, oh, it's because the longer the message, the more powerful the loss, like signal that goes back. Or I don't know. They gave some, like, it's a strangeness of the architecture, but it just occurred to me also that when you show these graphs, although they are the inputs to the language sorted by frequency, like natural language emerges not just with constraints on communication, but also there are like a lot of correlations between words, and language needs to, I don't know, accommodate that. Whereas in emergent communication in this game, all the words are independent from each other. You're sampling independently. So do you think like this behavior, cost aside, the cost is definitely super important to add. If we sampled like with correlations between words as well, let's say if you think about the co-occurrences of bigrams and not just.
But you can see this agent as an autoregressive model, so there is not really dependency of the way you're sampling, right? You're sort of like in the model that autoregressively generates some symbols, so there is some temporal knowledge.
I'm referring, or maybe I don't understand how the game works, but I thought that the way this game works is like, for the purpose of this experiment, we have 1,000 possible inputs, and then in this experiment, we sample input number 0, like, I don't know, half the time, and input number 1, quarter of the time, and so on. But there is no like pairs of inputs that correlate with each other in any way, and then the language
Dependence of on the input side.
yeah. I wonder if that, like, has there been work trying to look at that, or would that be another like possible explanation besides the cost?
Not that I know of. I think it would be interesting to like study. There were some few words that try to modify the input distribution that sort of like reflects the real world occurrences, and see if that is also reflected in the language, and that's usually the case. But I think here the point was more like how the representation is completely anti-efficient compared to. I think it makes sense. They don't have any explicit bias, so they just generate as much as they can. Unlike humans, we have some metabolic constraints that we don't.
In a rush, I can ask in the end.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, quick. Thanks.
These other words that sort of like show how word boundaries can be found, even though these segments do not seem to carry a clear-cut meaning like they do in human language. There's some other work to sort of show you can study cultural evolution of language, where a pair of agents learn a language, and this gets transmitted to new agents and sort of simulates the evolution across generation. Yeah, you can ask later, or I can send you this, but it sort of like covers most of the analysis work done in the Emergent. And now I guess the identity messages that it's often difficult to induce a structured protocol in emergent communication for some definition of structure, unless some explicit tweaks are added to the game setup. And this might be okay if you only want to test a linguistic hypothesis. You define your hypothesis, you add the constraints that you want to study, and you see how that affect your experiments. But if you care about more about an applied scenario where you might want to have agent and human communicating, this is bad news. And this is because we can easily map these two levels of abstraction, or at least we can do it very easily, given how dissimilar how distant they are. And then that sort of like leads to asking the question and making the observation that if you want this complex communication scenario, deep emergent communication alone might not get us that far. And we should possibly look at how large language models sort of develop this very powerful linguistic prior, and how they can be embedded in the communication game, sort of dropping this initial strong assumption that the agents shouldn't have any type of pre-encoded knowledge. So now in this second part, I'll focus more on this deep emergent communication in the language model, large language model era, and I'll present this setup. So these are two papers that we did. The first one is the one I'm showing here, which is more an analysis paper, and then another one where agents are actually learning to interact by playing the game, which will be publishing next week at CPR. Whereas here there is no much learning happening to interaction. It's sort of like everything is zero shot. They're just communicating after they have been pre-trained with some sort of language information, and they're just zero shot generalizing, trying to coordinate without any adaptation phase. That's why here you don't need to think about a tabula rasa agent anymore, but rather an image conditioned language model. It gets an image, generate a caption, knowing some sort of idea of language or how it should be generated if you get an input as an image. And here you should think about a text condition image retriever that giving a caption sort of is able to like point or map to the target image and retrieve it. In this setup, we use what we call a contextual data set. That's the image code data set from Crozier and colleagues, meaning that given an input target, the structures, the other images, are sampled from consecutive frames in videos, and that's why they look very similar, and that's why we call them as hard distractors, sort of simulating the real world. We have to discriminate between similar objects or have some close temporal discrimination to make why we use language. Taking for a second a step back, what did humans did when they were to play this game among themselves of coming up with a description of this contextual, highly contextual data set? They would say something: hands are stretching out of a piece of fur, gold nail polish on the right thumb is visible, and the tip of the thumb is cut off, blah, blah, blah. And it's interesting to see that, these images look very similar, and humans come up with a very precise, discriminative description of the image, relying on these perceptual features. It's something like gold nail polish on the right thumb is visible, which is not the case in this other image. Or here they would say the first word and the first letter of the text above the man at the desk are light in white. That's why you see the C here. If we play this game where images are generated from humans and the retriever is human, and the random baseline is 10%, given that there are 10 images to choose from, performance is well above the baseline of 54% accuracy in retrieving the correct image. And that's instead very much lower and closer to the baseline if we use a neural retriever, sort of hinting that these models don't really understand this language, or at least they don't do like we humans do. If we now turn back to the game where agents were to generate the captions, what we see them doing is saying something: a person holding a water bottle with a dog in it. And you need to remember that these are images that were never seen by the agents before. But at least the idea of seeing these two images and something looking like bottles, there is some sort of mapping between what they say and what's in it. Or here they would say a picture of a kitchen with a bunch of television on it, which again doesn't seem super descriptive, and surely doesn't seem discriminative between these two. But yeah, that is what they came up with.
Asking a question that's kind of unrelated. Do you think that it means the picture or the kitchen? And the same before, if you go to the previous one, there's dog ears in the background. You think that it is the picture or the bottle?
I think here it's the water bottle.
Okay.
Yes, because it has fur, like a dog.
No, I see that, but we don't know, right? It's right. Okay. Just curious.
Is the meaning that the agent attributes to these words are the same to our understanding of the meaning of these words in English, or it can use the English vocabulary to encode different stuff?
I think that's actually the point of this experiment of how, if on the surface it seems human language, it is human language, and we might have very anthropocentric view where like, oh, they use language the same way we do. This might not really be the case.
Because I can use English words to describe something completely different. It look like garbage, which it looks like.
And this is what we call semantic drift, or this language drift that the agents are doing.
I think that's really interesting.
So if we have this language given to the neural models and we use human retrievers to play the game, humans are not able to use these captions, so performance drops very close to the baseline. Surprisingly, if we instead use neural retrievers, performance is surprisingly high, and we see compared to the human captions, a reverse pattern. So performance with neural caption is well above chance when a neural retriever is given, hinting that agents are able to understand this complex strategy, like you were saying, maybe referring to things differently compared to we humans do, even though if on the surface this is clearly English language.
With them to, for example, regions in the image, and can you associate words with basically with visual elements to see what is actually the meaning of individual words in this language?
I mean, you might look at things like the attention patterns, I guess, but we didn't do it. But I think it would be interesting.
So, in this neural, is there any training, or it's just?
Sure. In the follow-up paper, there's some training that we need that. So with some basic analysis, what we found is that neural captions are shorter, and they also have a more complex structure. They use, you see light green here, human captions, and dark neural one. They use more adjectives, more auxiliaries, conjunction, whereas neural ones use more nouns. And interestingly, this y-axis is frequency, x-axis is part of speech. Here, y-axis is again frequency. X-axis is type count. So how many words we're used only once, only 2, 3 times, and so on. And we see that human captions use many more times words only once. So sort of use more like rarer words more often. And it tells us that there are different ways of processing human versus machine language, and is given by accuracy when the neural retrieval was performing the game. But there are also different production strategies between how humans and machines sort of come up with this description. And again, this is the point Mado was making. Even when these pre-trained language models process text that resemble plain English, their language processing mechanism might differ from how we instead process language. And I think this might sound like a bug, but I think it can be a feature. If we understand this gap between human and machine protocols, I think we might exploit it to design better language model-based human-machine or even machine-machine or heterogeneous interactive setup. So very briefly, trying to conclude, I think a bit of speculation where I think we should go from here. And I think sort of revising the fact that emergent communication can be an alternative to this passive language learning by providing this interactive paradigm. I think it's important to see them as sort of like collaborating and sort of trying to see how they can be there can be mutual benefits between the two. And I think these large language models can provide useful language-mediated prior over word and categories by the way they're learning. And the emergent communication setup, the framework and analysis ideas can be used to get insights or define methods on how we can model this functional aspect of the language prior and sort of like putting the language in context and being used in a context-dependent setup. And this sort of like should be seen as giving from dyads of tabula rasa agents to communities of language models, where each of them might have been learning its own model of the word, similar to how we humans do, and they need to adapt and evolve their communication protocol by interacting with other different language models and achieving, as I said, more complex and more useful skills than they could do alone. And this can be even more useful if we plug in this more heterogeneous setup humans. And I think that's the juicy part, how this can benefit like animal communication. And I think the dyads only setup might provide us some sort of like methods or insights of how we can decode these non-human languages. But what I really like, and I think it's sort of piggybacking on the idea of if we are jamming with sperm whales, we might sort of have a way to generate interaction data. I think this can be a nice framework to sort of cheaply and in a non-invasive way, assuming that we have a good model of the animal and assuming we have a good way to model this interaction, we might have some insight from observing some amount of data of this sort of jamming interaction with animals. We might gather even more data and sort of test in the lab in a cheap, useful way this interaction that we want to study. So to conclude, I first want to point to this library. So if you want to play with it, there is a library that we developed at FAIR that has some of these abstraction algorithms and models already implemented for you to try. But to conclude, I think deep learning has proved as a valuable tool to provide general learning machines that are able to bootstrap a non-random communication protocol. I think for some definition of non-random or structured, I think we can see that. And deep emergent communication can be a powerful setup to study communication in this multi-agent interactive scenario, or also to validate some theories of language acquisition. But especially if you're interested in the more applied communicative setup, important attention should be paid on the training setup, given that important tweaks should be applied if we want some nice properties of natural language emerging. And exploiting the recent engineering and research advances in language models is, I think, where we should go if we want to unlock the best of both worlds of having a good language prior and putting this language prior in use. That concludes my talk, and it's sort of like a summary of how I see working in emergent communication, going from the reaction gathered towards throughout the years, where people think that my friends think I would be creating the next generation of Terminator, or the press a few years ago that sort of like thought that this odd combination of hyperparameters that led to this wrong language that the researchers had to Control-C to get the good one was actually 2 weeks away from the end of the word. Up to me that what I think that I really do is just like thinking about these communication problems while coding and adding yet another bug to my PyTorch code all the time. And thank you.
Pass the microphone around for questions.
I apologize if you already said, I came in partway through the talk, so if you said this before, forgive me. When you're clip, did you use clip?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, cool. That was.
Do I have it? Yes. Clip was our neural retriever or the receiver agent that we use.
Okay. And so when you were doing this, here, yeah. Where did it go? So this was all using the same latent representation. I put an image in, get a clip latent representation, or I put in text and I get a clip latent representation, and then I compare the distance.
Yes.
Okay.
The two transformer tower, the text encoder and the image encoder of clip.
Okay.
For the receiver.
Thank you. Sorry for repeating what was already.
No, I didn't say it, but I mean, I think.
Thank you for the talk. It was great. Back to when you observed that inverse relationship between the frequency and the length of the messages. My question was there any type of error correction observed, like any parity beat or something like that? And if not, was this, or are there any experiments using the same game, but this time through a noisy channel?
I think most of the work that I'm aware of doesn't take that assumption, mostly to sort of like simplify the setup and not add another variable of that would sort of like alter possibly the results. I guess here the question is what is happening assuming you have a perfect setup where there is no noise and there is no communication error happening. But I think it would be interesting.
Thank you.
I think Michael made this point that, I mean, really what we're talking about is a vocabulary, right? Because we're talking about essentially ostension towards an object as the task. Have you or has anybody looked at emergent communication in like an agentic situation where you have two agents that have a variety of tasks and that need to communicate with one another to accomplish those tasks? One of which might be identifying the same object, but maybe the other is like coordinating activity, because that would seem to be way more analogous to what we're talking about with dolphins or whales, right? They have a whole variety. I mean, they literally can't point to things.
Yes, there have been some studies where I think those are more within the like reinforcement learning embodied RL literature. And even there, sort of like the same pipeline applies. So the analysis work sort of show that there is some structure happening, there is some compositionality happening to a certain extent. And the tasks were, again, similar to this one, just in a more embodied setup. So like going to a specific goal object for reaching a target goal, or moving objects in the setup. And again, all the structure that we're interested in doesn't emerge naturally. So I think that's the take-home message. But if you want some specific things like, for instance, like verb-like words to emerge, You might enforce this in the setup, but first communicating in the first round something that would be like what you have to do, and then communicating what the argument of the action should do. That is something that has been done and has been found in emergent communication. Yes.
Right. Well, thank you very much. All right. Next up, Pratusha and Jacob.